Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to another installment of disturbing books that I have read. This is going to be part 4 already. If you haven't checked out the other parts, there's a playlist on my channel somewhere where you can find all of them compiled. So as always, I want to start this video by saying thank you to all of my viewers. Thank you to all of the comments and suggestions that have come about. And I want to do the format of this series basically the way that it was for part 2, in which I want to open up by reading out suggestions that viewers and commenters have left as to books that they found disturbing, books that they found unsettling for a variety of reasons, before I jump into my own picks for disturbing, unsettling, unusual works. You know the drill. So I've compiled a couple of comments. I compiled these comments a couple of weeks ago, and since then more commenters have left even more suggestions, which of course I'm very appreciative of. Keep those coming. I really do read every single one of them, and I will try to feature them in a future video, and do the format this way from now on, if possible. But these are the ones that I was able to fish out in the moment that I compiled the list. So there's been more since, just letting you know. And then another thing I want to talk about is I've been wearing hats for the last 2 videos that I've made now. If you're wondering why that is, I fucked my own shit up basically. We're in quarantine, so I've been cutting my own hair, and we had a little bit of a mishap, so I'm trying to spare you the horrificness that is under this hat. Just in case anybody was curious. Okay, so we're gonna get started with the comments that my wonderful viewers and commenters have left for me. Dune O says, interesting list. Thank you. Although there are a lot of intense and hardcore books that would outdo those in the list, this was left in my first video, I believe. He says, for instance, Tomb for 500,000 Soldiers by Guyotat. And that is something that I've gotten a lot. It's an interesting conversation to be had. Certainly, there is a lot of transgressive fiction of an essentially violent and brutal kind. I believe it's known as extreme fiction. There's also splatterpunk, that kind of thing, which focuses solely, or zooms in specifically on bodily violence, mutilation, that kind of thing. I believe that's what Dune O is referring to. I've certainly read books of that kind and enjoyed them. There's a time and a place for everything. But for this particular series, I just wanted to kind of make it clear, we're not going to solely focus on things that are just violent and disturbing for violence's sake and that kind of thing. I think, it's safe to say that so far I have made an attempt to include books that are disturbing for different, a variety of reasons, kind of get more of a nuanced definition on disturbing literature and what it really is, and how, it's subjective what tends to disturb us or rattle us. So I think, I appreciate the suggestion, of course, and the engagement. And certainly if anybody's interested in fiction of that kind, there's Tomb for 500,000 Soldiers by Guyotat. Give it or if anybody else has read it and wants to be a little more specific about what makes that book disturbing, always appreciate that as well. But yeah, I kind of tend to gravitate more towards books that are disturbing for other reasons, for, that are sort of more, you wouldn't think of calling a book disturbing, but it's disturbing because of X, Y, and Z. And that's what I make an effort to include. And also, an effort to include works that are less talked about in the realm of disturbing literature. Because we've all seen people talk about American Psycho for, 20,000 times. So, maybe keeping it a little more varied, a little more nuanced is ultimately the goal of this series. Up next, Austin Pratt said, outside the horror genre, the most disturbing piece of fiction I have ever read is In the Ravine by Anton Chekhov. The title varies in translation, but the "I didn't see this coming" shock survived a second reading. Curious if anyone else has experienced this story likewise. And then he says, your reviews are excellent. Thank you so much for those kind words, Austin. I've never read In the Ravine, never read any work by Chekhov. But this is kind of more what I'm talking about from the sound of it. It's a book that you wouldn't tend to look at as disturbing fiction, but there must be something about it that's shocking and unsettling. So I'm definitely very interested in that. And, you know, as Austin himself says, he's curious if anyone else has experienced this story in a similar manner. You know, if they found it disturbing for some reason as well. So if you've read this book, go ahead and let me know in the comments so that maybe we can get a conversation started about that. I definitely appreciate the support and the comments, and sort of keeping in that spirit of, you know, you wouldn't think this is disturbing, but to me it was because of this and that. So thank you, Austin, for your wonderful comment and your, you know, kind and supportive words. Really appreciate it. William Castro said, have you read The Conspiracy Against the Human Race by Thomas Ligotti? And if so, what are your thoughts? And I went ahead and let him know in the comments that no, I have never read it. But I have read Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grim Scribe by Ligotti in the past. And I am ready to be crucified and vilified by the horror community. Maybe I deserve it. But I was not a fan. I'm not a fan of Thomas Ligotti's short fiction. I didn't really do much for me. But I understand The Conspiracy Against the Human Race is a non-fiction work of a sort of more philosophical kind, or maybe some sort of like literary or cultural criticism. So if he's drawing from sort of more academic, philosophical sources, then I would certainly not be opposed to maybe try and read that. And yeah, if it's of a different kind of disturbing, you know, if it's disturbing because of the philosophical or cultural implications, definitely I will give this a try if I ever come across it. But yeah, as far as his fiction, not really for me. But you know, William, thank you so much for your comment and your suggestion. I will definitely be keeping an eye out for that book. And if anybody else has read it, go ahead and let me know what you thought about it. Let's see. Rebecca Rodriguez says The Troop by Nick Cutter is along the same lines of John Dollar and Lord of the Flies. If you haven't seen part 2 of the series, where I talk about John Dollar and compared to Lord of the Flies as a sort of like children stranded on an island, being left to, you know, survive and basically construct their own community, and eventually devolves into chaos and debauchery. I'm not sure if The Troop follows that same formula of like children in peril and abandoned, but maybe along the same lines, maybe in setting or in premise, I'm not sure. She says, super graphic, told in painful detail. It stuck with me for weeks. I have gotten a copy of Troop by Nick Cutter. Here it is. And I have not read it yet, but I'm definitely interested because Rebecca was only one of maybe 3 or 4 people that actually recommended that I read this. So I am very excited to get to it. Someone else had said that, you know, they had read it and that they thought it was disappointing, that it was kind of like, you know, overhyped or simplistic, or not that in-depth about the subject matter that it touches upon. I forget the exact words, but, you know, I'm still down. Something doesn't have to be mind-bending and life-changing for me to appreciate it. I can get down with just brainless, gory fun, which sounds to be the case for this. But yeah, I've gotten a copy of it, and I'm definitely going to be reading it. So I'll let you know my thoughts on it whenever that happens. Up next, Alex says, great video. Thank you so much, Alex. Then he says, some others I found very disturbing are blank. You see, I redacted it because the first suggestion that Alex left, I am going to be talking about as one of my picks. So I didn't want to spoil anything, but Alex, yes, that one, and I will be getting more in depth into that later on in the video, so stick around. But then he said The Necrophiliac by Gabrielle Wittkop. Although I found the latter, as in The Necrophiliac, to be beautifully written, it was tough to get through. So I went ahead and looked this up, though maybe I didn't even need to. I mean, just by the title, we can guess what it's about. But yeah, What I found particularly interesting about it is that it's an older work, I believe published sometime in the 70s. And I tend to gravitate towards older literature. Maybe you know this about me already, because I feel like the ecstasy of influence in the 21st century is just a little bit too much. And I feel like writers are sort of more conscious about the transgressive or disturbing content that they put into their works, especially now that, I mean, I'm making an entire list about, an entire series of videos about it, and people are responding positively to it. So, there is a market for readers of disturbing literature. And I feel like more modern authors who focus on that kind of literature are sort of aware of the marketing and, sort of consumer aspect of this. And to me, it just tends to feel a little more forced. But yeah, I feel like, as is with the case maybe with the Necrophiliac by Wittkop, I've never read it, but if it's an older work, they tend to have less of a frame of reference of what consumers of disturbing literature want. They're literally just screaming into a void, trying to get this perverse, deviant sort of figurations and imaginations out. And they tend to be a lot more disturbing. I tend to be a little bit more prejudiced towards older works that way, although there's certainly newer works that have been beyond disturbing as well. But yeah, that alone has caught my interest, and I will definitely be looking out for the Necrophilia by Gabrielle Wittkop. So thank you so much for the comment, the suggestion. As always, very, very appreciated. So up next, Carrie Marie, who has left quite a couple of comments throughout my videos, and I'm really always appreciate seeing your comments. I appreciate your support. And then they say, Juan, I think you would love The Butterfly Garden by Hutchison. Beyond disturbing, they say. I've never heard of this book. I looked it up a little bit. I didn't want to get spoiled or anything, so I just read a little bit about it. Apparently, it involves kidnappings of some sort. It involves sort of disturbing, perhaps torture. I'm not really sure. Butterflies figure prominently into this disturbing elements. So I'm definitely very interested in that. So if anybody else has read this, and if they want to leave a comment or two with some descriptors about why it's disturbing, why they found it disturbing, without spoilers, please. I don't really enjoy spoilers in the comments, or at least tag them, spoilers or whatever. But yeah, it sounds like something I'll definitely be interested in. Maybe a future installment in the series if I get around to getting a copy or something. So thank you, Cara Marie, for your continued support, and of course for your comment. I'll be looking out for this one. And then Paul Darrow says, in your first video, you mentioned The Eye by Georges Bataille, of course, referring to A Story of the Eye, the first book I talked about in my first video. He says, he wrote another book called My Mother, which is very disturbing and was made into a movie. It's French with subtitles and called it Ma Mère, and you can watch it on Amazon Prime. Thank you for that information. Also, a book written during some 20 years before The Story of the Eye, written by the anarchist Mirbeau, written in 1899, called The Torture Garden, is one of the most intense books of its kind. It's not an easy read. Thank you so much for your comment, Paul. As always, with Georges Bataille, all I'll say is I am very much interested in exploring more of his works. I've read Story of the Eye. I've read the Crimes of Gilderay, I believe that's what it's called. It's a sort of non-fiction detailed account of one of the most infamous serial killers, one of the earliest serial killers in French history, which was amazing. And now My Mother, you've brought to my attention. I'll definitely be looking out for that, because I do want to make a video in which Bataille will figure prominently. Not necessarily a video just about him, but about the kind of literary movement that he was a part of. So I'll just say that, and I'll be looking out for that movie too if I can catch it somewhere. And as far as The Torture Garden by Mirbeau, who was apparently an anarchist, I'm very much sold on that as well, especially since you mentioned 1899, the year it was published. Like I said, I am very partial to older literature. I am very much gravitate towards older literature. So if it's a work of disturbing literature, I read a little bit about it. Of course, it's about torture, as the title states, and apparently it also involves a great deal of political commentary. So very much sounds very interesting, sounds like something I would really enjoy, so I'll be looking out for that. And I feel like as of late, I've been reading more sort of newer works because BookTube has turned me into newer works. Before I started doing BookTube, I didn't really read any like 21st century literature at all. So it's been sort of broadening my horizons, and I'm very appreciative of that. But, a good old, long 19th century work, I'm down. Always down. So thank you for that, Paul. Thank you for your comment. Thank you for the suggestions. I'll be looking out for them. And, if it's French, if it's an older work, I'm usually game. There was something going on in France, in the 19th and 20th centuries. And even before that, I hope French people, I hope y'all are doing all right now, because there was something going on. I hope y'all work that out. But yes, thank you for the unforgettable, disturbing literature that you produced. And finally, for this, but of course, there's been more suggestions. And if I missed yours, don't worry, I will be featuring it later on, because I'm going to do a deep dive into the comments and pull out whatever I haven't mentioned in any installments in the viewer suggestion segments. But this one comes from Catherine Lichtenberger. I hope I pronounced that right. I don't know if anyone has mentioned it yet, but The End of Alice by A.M. Holmes was super disturbing to me. It made me feel very uncomfortable. Catherine, you were the first one to bring this book up, but since your comment, there have been a couple of other people, like 2 or 3, who have mentioned the same book, The End of Alice. Someone in one of the newest comments, someone mentioned it's akin to Celeste, the main character from Tampa, being instructed by Humbert from Lolita on how to seduce someone. So when I read that, I thought, okay, that's definitely going in the I'm good, I don't need to read this pile, because sexual abuse against children that just I cannot stomach, and it's a personal limit that I place on myself, and it's kind of, it's an interesting conversation to open up, because I've featured, books before where child sexual abuse figures, of course, The Girl Next Door, which I talked about in my first video ever. But I've also mentioned books of the same kind that I just cannot read, like Tampa, like Lolita, which I haven't finished either. Hog, these books that I can't. And it's kind of an iffy situation. It's kind of iffy to say that, because it might come across as like I'm saying, I do read about sexual abuse, but sometimes it's more palatable than there's no charting, there's no measuring what's more disturbing than not when it comes to content of that sort. I would never want to send a message across of that sort, but it's just, like I said, deeply personal reasons. This content, the subject matter is deeply triggering to me, and I tend to avoid it. If it's in a work like The Girl Next Door, or if it's featured somewhere, but not as profusely, and there's something much more significant, or something else going on with the characters that inhabit the plot, whatever moves the plot forward, I can usually get through it just fine. But when it's the centerpiece, when it's the entirety of the narrative, like Tampa, like Hog, like apparently The End of Alice, I don't think I can do it. So again, purely for personal reasons. But yeah, if I don't pass judgment on people that read this, and of course I would never place a limit on artistic expression or a censor. I don't think anything should be off limits. I do think that there should be a kind of a critical thinking that goes into the reading of works like this. Like, people who might get titillated or exhilarated by this type of work, that is like, no, you there is something wrong with you. But people that read these works to test the limits of taste and artistic expression, I don't pass any judgment in that regard. And I think it is important for books like this to exist, because it's always important to keep talking about subject matter of this sort, as you will see later on when I tell you about one of my picks for this video, which kind of touches upon the subject matter too, and which I almost didn't finish, but I powered through it. It's important to have these conversations. It's important to keep talking about them, because if we stop writing about something, chances are we will forget about it. And this is a good thing to always keep at the forefront of our conscience. So The End of Alice, if any of you are interested in exploring literature of that kind, that's where it is. I'm going to pass on that one. And that's the end of the comments, suggestions. Again, thank you so much for all the comments. Keep them coming. If you didn't see your comment in this video, if you didn't see your suggestion, don't worry. It's more than likely going to pop up in a future video, in a future installment, because this series is going to keep going. I'm hoping to make a part 5, part 6, part 7, however many I can churn out. So yeah, always appreciate the suggestions. And a suggestion of mine for the comments, well, you can do whatever you want in the comments. The comments are for you to do as you like. But, you know, I always especially appreciate when people leave suggestions. If you just leave the title and name of the author, that's fine. But if you could give like a descriptor or two, not necessarily about the plot, you know, no spoilers or like plot summaries, but, you know, just a descriptor or two, a word or two, or a sentence about why particularly you thought this book was disturbing. That always helps to facilitate the conversation about it. And then I have something to latch onto when I mention it in my videos. And of course, you know, any kind of disturbing literature is welcome, you know, the violent, you know, the usual suspects of that kind. But, you know, if it's something that you think disturbed you, but you don't think it would necessarily disturb other people, you know, I'm very much interested in that as well. So, you know, leave comments of that sort too. Those suggestions I also really appreciate. And yeah, thank you so much for all of the support. And without further ado, now I am going to dive into my 5 picks for this video of my own additions to this disturbing books list that we have going on here. And yeah, let's get into it. So first off on my list, I'm going to be talking about a book, again, that some people might not find disturbing or unsettling, but I certainly found it to be a uneasy and very thought-provoking read. This is The 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch by Philip K. Dick. If you watched my bookshelf tour video that I made a couple of weeks back, you know that I had this entire phase with Philip K. Dick. I became obsessed with his writing. I wanted to read everything that he wrote, which is, of course, a really large task that I was ultimately a failure in completing. But I did read quite a few of his books, and I was absolutely overjoyed with, you know, all the novels that I read by him. But this in particular was the strangest, the most thought-provoking, the most mind-bending, and ultimately the most unsettling work by him that I came across. So this was first published in 1965, so it's an older work, and of course very psychedelically influenced, to say the least. Let me try and describe this plot, because if you've read this, you know that's quite a task. So basically, we're living in this sort of dystopian society in which climate change has absolutely ravaged the Earth. The Earth is near uninhabitable. It's, you know, Antarctica is like this resort because it's the last kind of like section of Earth with agreeable climate. And, you know, to try to sort of dissuade this suffering on Earth, or to try to, you know, instate some kind of population control, there have been these involuntary missions, these drafts in which people are shipped off against their will to try, you know, to on a colonizing mission to try to, you know, make other planets habitable or inhabit other planets, but really it's just a ploy to kind of get population under control. Of course, due to the unbearable environments and living situations all throughout the universe, pretty much all of humanity has resorted to the recreational use of a particular drug called Candy, CAN-D, which places people in this sort of communal hallucination where people can interact through each other's hallucinations. And there's even this company called Perky Pat, which has manufactured these artificial environments in which people can act out their hallucinations with each other. Very strange stuff. So basically, where Palmer Eldritch comes in, the titular character of our story, he is a person who has been on a mission to Pluto and ultimately discovered another substance called Chew-Z, CHEW-Z, which has similar psychological effects when ingested as Candy does, but Chew-Z appears to be much more addictive, and it appears to have much more vivid and engrossing hallucinations. And so, you know, the manufacturers of Candy are afraid that this new substance is going to put them out of business. And so it's ultimately, you know, a story about the ploy to try to take Palmer Eldritch and Chew-Z down. But what's ultimately so unsettling and disturbing about it are, the descriptions of the effects of this drug on the human mind. In fact, Palmer Eldritch becomes this sort of god who has introduced this manna of choosy onto mankind. And in fact, the hallucinations that it triggers sort of elevate him to the stance of a god. And this is where Philip K. Dick introduces his sort of religious imagery that, becomes much more prominent in later on in other of his works. But yeah, there's something about that mind altering aspect of substance use, and it's particularly the main reason why I don't take any recreational drugs, because I am deathly afraid of losing control of my own agency and losing control of my mind. That to me is one of the most disturbing things. And of course, Philip K. Dick, being an absolute insane individual, portrays this collapse of reality, this collapse of human integrity through the mind. In fact, we start to see reality being bent, folded into simulation, the two sort of conflating and becoming one. And the narrative ultimately becomes so disjointed and so disorienting and so mind-boggling that I found that to be an extremely unsettling plot to try to keep track of. And like I said, it also touches upon a subject matter of climate change, of how uninhabitable and how unfriendly the entirety of the universe is towards our fragile, our fragile bodies and our fragile minds. Of course, Philip K. Dick is making a very thorough exploration of the fragility of the human mind and of our perception of reality. And that to me is some of the most mind-bending, most bizarre, most just absolutely bonkers subject matter that I have ever read about. Philip K. Dick, if you are unfamiliar with his work, maybe this is not the best introductory work, but once you get a sort of feel as to what he's about and the themes that he explores, this is definitely a strange, powerful, thought-provoking, and to me, really unsettling read. I mean, just reading about losing control of not being able to tell what's real and what's not anymore, and, losing your inhibitions, that's really creepy stuff to me. It's kind of like a film like Existence by David Cronenberg, those kinds of narratives where you don't know what's real, you don't know what's simulated. Unsettling stuff for me, disturbing stuff for me. So definitely check that out if you're interested in that. Again, this might not register as disturbing to a lot of people, but I'm sure some will share my views on it. And also, the company that produces Candy, the drug that makes this sort of communal hallucination, is named Perky Pat, which is an allusion to one of his earlier works of short fiction, The Days of Perky Pat. And that, even though it's a short story, that is my favorite work of Philip K. Dick. So check that out too. That one's not really as disturbing or mind-bending, but it's just definitely very intriguing, sort of socially relevant commentary. But yeah, Philip K. Dick, amazing author. Love his work. And this one is of a particularly disturbing taste and sensibility. Up next, I'm going to talk about a book that I don't have on me. I don't have my physical copy. I think I threw it out in storage somewhere, which should be a testament to how much it it disturbed me. So again, as I mentioned, this is kind of a book that initially I felt compelled to sort of toss into that category along with Tampa and, the suggestions like the end of Alice of like, I'm good, I don't need to read this, I cannot read this. But ultimately I powered through it. And it's because of, Brian Evenson's prowess as a narrative voice. And I think his books really sort of carry you sometimes against your will through his stories. The book that I'm talking about is Father of Lies, published in 1998. This is the story of Eldon Fuchs. Yes, that his last name is Fox. Fochs. They make a whole joke about it in the book too. This is a sort of an everyday man. He lives, in a conservative region of America. He has a wife and two kids, and he's very involved. He's a sort of official in the local church that he's part of, and he's a very sort of prominent community figure. But then at the suggestion of his wife, who's becoming increasingly more and more suspicious of his behavior, he goes to a psychologist, and the psychologist ultimately unravels the meaning behind the strange dreams that Eldon has been having, that Mr. Fox has been having, concerning the constant visions of a sexual abuse that he's enacted upon children and members of his church, and the sort of increasingly more perverse and deviant impulses that he's exhibiting, and ultimately the psychological and then later on criminal investigation that unfolds because of these snippets of information that he's been letting out during therapy, uncover that his nightmares may indeed really not be nightmares at all, and Eldon Fox may indeed be an actual criminal who has been molesting children and may ultimately elevate into, killing. From what you can tell from my plot synopsis, when I started to read it and things of this nature started to unfold, I thought, okay, no, I can't do this. If the whole book is going to be like this, I don't want to read this. Really, really unsettles me, especially because later on, what becomes much more prominent than this sort of criminal investigation and the sort of diary-like entries from Eldon and his twisted fantasies is that, like I said, he's highly involved in the local church of his community, and the church officials, to try to save their reputation and to try to save face, ultimately embark on an aggressive campaign to try to cover up all the information, just to make sure that no more dirt is laid out onto their institution. And this, of course, is an incredibly prescient, societal concern, a very real problem that we see in, institutions of religion. And in fact, one of the main reasons that drove me to sort of distance myself from religious institutions. But, so if it was socially relevant in that sense, I thought I owe this book at least the courtesy of trying to finish it, even though, I really don't care about, just exposing myself or, going through the kind of narrative that Evenson is unraveling before us. But, I finished it, and I ultimately thought, okay, this was such a sickening, such a gut-wrenching and infuriating, ultimately very infuriating narrative. But I thought, you know what, that's good. And I'm glad that I read it, because it's supposed to be that way. Obviously, it's supposed to infuriate you and kindle you to pressing social concerns that are actually very alarming and continue to exist in our nation and elsewhere. So I thought, this is a very potent, powerful piece of literature. It's fiction, but as we know, some of fiction is ultimately lying about the truth. And Brian Evenson, of course, he's a great author. I've read other works by him before. Last Days was a fantastic novel. His short story collection, Songs for the Unraveling of the World. His other novel, which touches upon similar themes at this time of the Mormon Church, which he was a part of, called The Open Curtain. Yeah, so books like this, like he is an amazing author. I do like his writing. I think he is sort of this masterful. He has this masterful narrating voice, and it really carries you through. And like I said, that's sort of what kept me going when reading Father of Lies. But ultimately, it was very disturbing, and it's very detailed. And I don't want to spoil anything, but it was not satisfactory. It was just the horrors of abuse, the horrors of, just abuse, abuse of children, but also abuse of power, abuse of influence, that kind of thing. It's so unbelievably unsettling. I don't enjoy reading stuff like that, but ultimately I think that's the point. You're not supposed to enjoy that, and I'm not at all opposed to reading things that infuriate me or, spark a rage in me, as long as that rage is significant. So if you're interested in, learning more about how abuse can operate in institutions of religion who have a lot of, community influence and power, Father of Lies, Brian Evenson has done an amazing job. He's wrought a narrative that's so unbelievably powerful that I have to include it here. And I do recommend that you read it if you can. Up next, I have an entry by a Japanese author. And I found that in every single entry thus far, except for part 3, because that one was dedicated to Latin American women authors. But, parts 1 and 2, and now this one, I always include a Japanese author, because Japanese authors tend to have a propensity to write about disturbing works of fiction. and I love them for that. So I think, maybe I could make it a thing to always include one or two Japanese authors, or maybe make an entire installment on, disturbing works of Japanese fiction. That could also work. But the one that I am talking about this video is Out by Natsuo Kirino. This was originally published in Japan in 1997, first translated into English in 2004. This basically follows the initially sort of more mundane experiences of four women who work in a Japanese bento factory, which is a sort of like a restaurant where they make lunch, prepackaged lunch. And they all have these sort of jaded, disenchanted lives, full of domestic problems, full of disillusion. But one of the four women who work in this restaurant in particular is having a lot of issues with her husband, Kenji, who is abusive to her and her children, and who is sort of a deadbeat who gambles all their money away, is probably having an affair. And ultimately, in a episode of domestic violence in which the wife sort of snaps, finally she strangles her husband to death and enlists the help of her co-workers in dismembering the body, which is told in very vivid detail. And ultimately they dispose of it, but not being any professionals at disposing of cadavers, they don't do a very good job. And eventually, authorities are alerted to, they find a suitcase which contains some of the body parts that they thought they had gotten rid of. And another psychotic killer is involved in the sort of aftermath of what the murder has entailed for the community, for the people that surround these women. And ultimately the four women themselves, the four co-workers, sort of start to turn against each other. And it becomes this dance of, suspense, of, violence, of, interpersonal relationships turn into this hellish landscape, which I'm finding is a common theme in Japanese disturbing fiction, and which I appreciate very, very much. I always appreciate it when an author can take a mundane living situation and turn it into hell, which is what Natsuo Kirino has done in this book. She is amazing. I've read a couple of other books. You can see them somewhere up there. I've read Real World and Grotesque, which I think are actually the only works so far that have been translated into English of hers. All of them are phenomenal, but in particular, I recommend Out if you want to start out with, her writing. So horrific, so vivid in detail. So she is amazing at telling a story, at keeping track of characters, or bringing each character alive with their own sort of imperfections, with their own sort of quirks and perversities and hidden desires. It's just so engrossing, and I feel like she really creates a microcosm of tension that just elevates and elevates, and such a phenomenal work. It's such an amazing book. I read this a couple of months back, and I would not be opposed to maybe read it again because it was that good. It's just so amazing. It was adapted into a film which wasn't that good. I watched it. It was not good. So read the book. Don't worry. Don't bother with the film. But yeah, this is my entry for this video for Japanese disturbing fiction. Natsuo Kirino. She is an amazing author. Look out for all of her works. And yeah, if you're into sort of like thrillers with a sort of more of an edge to them, something that's going to unsettle you, surprise you, make you question, each character, make you uncomfortable, this is definitely the one. And it does not pull back on any of the graphic details either, which I always appreciate. So yeah, amazing work. Check it out. Next up, Alex, who recommended, as I said before, The Necrophiliac by Wittkop. He recommended two books, and the first one I redacted because it's the one that I'm going to be recommending now. So yes, Alex, I have read Zombie by Joyce Carol Oates, and I do feel like it deserves its own entry into this list, and for me to go a little bit more in depth into it. So Zombie is based, Joyce Carol Oates, by the way, she's an amazing American author, one of the greatest American authors still living today. She is not a horror author. She does not pigeonhole herself into any genre. She has written about everything: historical fiction, romance, drama, thrillers, horror. She's written it all. And this is one of her few but significant entries into the realm of horror, or maybe crime novel, whatever you would want to call it. I would say this is pretty much straight up horror, just in how unbelievably horrific it was. So yeah, Joyce Carol Oates, she's an amazing narrative voice. This book is based on the final years of Jeffrey Dahmer's career as a serial killer. And as we know, Jeffrey Dahmer was a killer who was actively murdering male victims, usually homosexual male victims of color, in Wisconsin during the 80s and 90s. And the acts that he performed on them were of an extremely perverse, deranged kind, sexual and cannibalistic. So what Joyce Carol Oates has done here is write a very, very short novel that is entirely narrated by the killer, this Jeffrey Dahmer-like guy who obsesses over his victims, who obsesses over bodies that he wants to own, control, and ultimately turn them into his own personal zombie slaves. There's a lot of of course, racially charged, disturbing, cursed energy that emanates from this narrative, as we know, as was the case with Jeffrey Dahmer. A good majority of the victims in here are Black men, and the fetishization of bodies and the treatment of this disjointed voice that's becoming more and more detached from reality and more sort of immersed in their own perverse fantasies. The way that Joyce Carol Oates is able to methodically tell that story and escalate it in such a subtle and masterful way. Incredible work, incredibly disturbing. One of the things that I found most disturbing about this is that it includes illustrations, very crude illustrations, meant to read as they were made by the killer. But some of the for example, one of his victims, he decides to start keeping souvenirs, as Dahmer did, from his victims, and one of them, what he keeps is a gold tooth. And what Carol Oates writes here is, this is the gold tooth kept, and it says right here the actual size, and there's the tooth, and there's something so creepy. There's something so unsettling about the fact that it's the actual size of the tooth. It's almost like you can hold it, you can behold the trophy that he has kept. It's such a masterful and creepy use of illustrations like that really made this a very different kind of narrative experience. And I think a lot of people were displeased by this, mostly by the ending of it, or lack of an ending. I hope that's not spoiling anything, but I really did not mind that at all, because I knew that this wasn't sort of a narrative. From the start, you can tell it's not a narrative with a plot progression, you go into rising action, climax, conclusion. It's more a character study into the increasingly turbid fantasies of somebody who is becoming much more and more deranged as the narrative progresses. And as I said, because it's all told through his voice, and it's so amazing that Joyce Carol Oates, a woman, is able to so effectively embody the perverse voice of a male killer. And I think she absolutely nails it. And this novel is so unbelievably unsettling. Fair content warning, of course, with anything that I talk about in this video. I mean, that should be evident by now, but yeah, it's just so amazing. I read this in one day. It's that kind of book. Also, it's very short, there's very short chapters that sort of keep you going. And it's not, it's not usual, like with thrillers, it's not like, oh, every chapter ends with a cliffhanger, so you have to keep going. It's just sort of more like, where is this going to go? Like how much more perverse is it going to go? Ultimately, like towards the middle of a book and in the second part of the book, he becomes obsessed over one particular guy specifically, whereas before his killing is just sort of more all over the place and disjointed. He starts to obsess over this one guy. He says this guy is going to make the perfect zombie. And the anticipation on what he's going to do with it, the plot that he develops to try to kidnap him and turn him into a zombie slave, and the methods, the slow, research that he does as to how it's best to, you know, zombify somebody, the crude sort of anatomical studies that he does, his relationship with his family, how he's able to so like seamlessly hide that darker part of himself, and his family, you know, fool him into thinking that nothing's wrong with him. It's just so unbelievable, so cerebral, so, you know, surreptitiously, you know, crawls under your skin. And then, you know, when things sort of escalate, it's you know, you have to read it to believe it. So yes, Joyce Carol Oates, amazing author, brilliant author, and this, one of her few entries into the genre of horror, absolutely phenomenal, well deserved of a spot on this video series. Oh, and I forgot to mention, Zombie by Joyce Carol Oates was published in 1995. That's 3 out of 5 entries on this list that were written in the 90s. I'm starting to get a feel that the 90s had really fucked up shit going on in their literature. I don't know what was going on, but I love it. I love the feel of 90s literature when it comes to sort of disturbing transgressive fiction. Certainly, if you know of more of it, let me know. And then the final entry on today's video is going to be Like Palmer Eldritch by Philip K. Dick, a book that, you know, not a lot of people would be compelled to, you know, perceive as disturbing or make it an entry into lists of this kind. But I personally found it to be extremely disturbing. And, you know, the implications, the sort of social and philosophical implications that drive a lot of its story. Again, like with Zombie, there's not a lot of like narrative progress or, you know, like a rising action or anything of this kind. It does seem to be more of a character study like Zombie. But from the genre of science fiction, it's We Who Are About To by Joanna Russ, first published in 1976. I found this to be so intriguing a concept, and so original and so fresh and so valid and powerful in the statements that it makes, specifically about space travel and, you know, space colonization, which with SpaceX or whatever the fuck Elon Musk is doing seem very prescient, important issues to discuss, specifically the ethics behind it. So We Who Are About To is the story of a, you know, it's set in a future where intergalactic travel has been conquered by mankind, and it's this fleet of sort of everymen and every women who are embarking on a mission to sort of land on a planet. I think it's about intergalactic travel, but they get stranded on an uninhabited planet. And once they assess that it is, you know, the environment is not harmful and that they can exist there, the men in the ship say, well, let's colonize it. And, you know, of course, the gender relations and implications behind that statement. Ultimately, the discussion falls on, well, the men are going to have sex with the women so that they can populate the planet. And the women are going to have to just comply if we want to see mankind sort of survive in this new environment that we are trying to colonize. The main narrator is female, and of course Joanna Russ is a feminist science fiction author, and I guess the cat's out of the bag. One of the future videos that I'm currently working on is going to be all about feminist science fiction, and you will see Joanna Russ resurface there as well. And I'm going to suggest another book of hers, but for this video, I thought this is better suited for a video on disturbing literature. Basically, it involves the main narrator, the woman's escape from, you know, the rest of her crew, who are, you know, the men are starting to enact sort of a more violent, possessive disposition towards the women. They're saying, you're going to have to comply to all of our commands if we're going to try and, you know, expand humanity onto this planet and bring about with us, you know, our social and political norms. And ultimately, what the narrator of this novel is questioning is, why do we always fall under, you know, those gender and social trappings behind colonialism and sexism and patriarchy? You know, being able to travel, you know, to the furthest reaches of the galaxy, to uninhabited planets. Why do we bring this colonist, you know, patriarchal baggage with us? Why is it that our imagination can only go so far as to try and continue this legacy of oppression wherever we are? Is it ultimately a fault in mankind in general? Mankind, you know, in, you know, always sort of fucking it up no matter where we are? Those questions are really unsettling, really thought-provoking. And ultimately what happens is that the main character escapes, fights back against, the rest of her crew, and ultimately her own decisions, being alone in this uninhabited planet, trying to decide if she should just kill herself, trying to decide if she should just keep living for the sake of living. Very sort of nihilistic, questions come about, the nature of life. What is the purpose of living? What is the purpose of continuing on, in a space that is so disjointed from the rest of humanity? Does it even matter? Can we even bring anything new to an environment that is unwelcoming or indifferent towards us? All of these amazingly powerful questions, center around the theme of space travel and intergalactic travel. Like I said, really interesting to think about, especially like I mentioned with like SpaceX, space travel. What are the kind of what kind of cultural baggage are we going to take with us along? Are we going to continue oppression? Are we going to continue exploitation no matter where we go? Such a deep and powerful work about the nature of mankind, about the nature of humanity, about the purposes of living, about what it means to be alive. And just so amazing. I don't know if I'm doing it justice with my words, but although it's a science fiction novel about space travel, Joanna Russ has wrought a narrative that is full of questions, that is full of unanswered enigmas, that really sort of got under my skin as I was reading it. And ultimately, what the main character decides to do, the struggles that, internal struggles that she faces, the psychological torments that she experiences in her isolation in an unknown planet are so far beyond disturbing. But again, it might not be disturbing to everybody, but if you're sort of vibing with what I'm saying in regards to this book, definitely check it out. And I assure you, it's a short, riveting, and such an uneasy read. Really, really recommend it. All right, so there are my 5 recommendations or picks for this list, along with the viewer suggestions. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to continue working on this series and keep pumping out parts 5, 6, whatever, however many it takes. So thanks so much for watching. Be sure to like this video and comment and subscribe if you haven't. Engagement with my videos is what helps me out the most. I will see you in whatever other video I put out. I think the feminist science fiction one is the one that I'm rushing to finish because I think it's going to be a really cool conversation. Hope everyone's doing well. Continue staying safe, and I'll see you in the next one.